We just got done discussing the process of infection, and we talked about how all these strategies that microbes have in order to be successful in establishing themselves in our bodies. We're the hosts. So the question that we'll address now is what kind of defenses does our body have against those microbes? So chapter 16 is innate immunity, and chapter 17 is adaptive immunity, and that will roll into a nice discussion of vaccines. All right, so what does our body need to protect itself from? I just did a Google search at one point and found, approximate numbers of different pathogens and parasites. Your body is constantly being bombarded with these things. So what does it take? What kind of defenses do we have to have so these things don't kill us? So that's what we'll be discussing going forward. What other roles does our immune system have? It's going to help repair any wounds that we get from many accidents. Our cells are constantly dying and be replaced, so there has to be some kind of cleanup mechanism. But it's extremely complicated, and sometimes things don't go right. So certainly there's potential for our immune system not to function properly, and we're more susceptible to these things, or the immune system has potential to inappropriately fire and cause damage when, some pathogen, some threat isn't present. Okay, so I didn't post this picture, but I stumbled upon that, and it just kind of gives you a nice snapshot of, again, the complexity that I referred to. So it has to be this way. It's good in order that we're protected. You can see that there's lots of overlapping function. Different cells do all sorts of different things. It makes it enormously difficult to figure out how to understand it. So immunology is kind of one of the younger sciences. It's difficult to know, like if we talk about macrophages, well, can we understand macrophages without understanding B cells and T cells or neutrophils? Like everything's all connected. So we'll do the best we can. I would say what we're covering is, loosely what the book covers. There's some things in the book that we won't go into such detail. There's a few things that I'll go into maybe a little better detail than what they do in your OpenStax textbook. But these concepts, I know some of you are going to be at least a little familiar with some of these cells from anatomy. But especially as we move into adaptive immunity, you're going to need to see this, several different times before it's really going to sink in. So, listen to lecture, obviously, read about it. If you haven't read your textbook very much, this is a good time to start. Hopefully the homework will reinforce some complex concepts. And again, it might take a little bit more to sink in. So a little bit of an overview before we do a little thought experiment. I mentioned innate and adaptive immunity. So what do we consider innate immune defenses? These are defenses that every time we are exposed to the pathogen, we get a very similar response. So in other words, there's not any learning that happens to make a, better fitted response. So, I mean, there's, I've talked about all throughout the semester, there's always exceptions to everything. And as we learn, we see, and actually in this case, this happens or whatever. But traditionally, again, our innate responses they're not nearly as specific as what our adaptive responses are. So what we consider innate physical barriers like the skin, there's a lot of antimicrobial chemicals, there's plasma protein mediators called complement, cytokines. That's what all of these ILs, these are all chemical messages being sent between cells. Inflammation is considered part of our innate defense. And we often think about that as bad, but it's actually good when it's short term. Lots of cells like neutrophils and basophils and macrophages. Okay, so that's considered innate. And then for adaptive immunity, that's the work of the T cells and the B cells that are made, again, to like tailor-made receptors that are going to recognize just about anything that we would ever come in contact with. Okay, so the question I always like to ask in class, that's always kind of fun, if you had to do without one branch of your immune system, would you do without your innate immunity, or would you be better off if you didn't have your adaptive immunity? Now, obviously, we want to have both, and we're keeping our skin on and all that. Assume your body is intact in that way. But if you had a not functioning innate system or a not functioning adaptive, which way would you likely live longer? Okay, so pause for a second, think about that. There actually are some studies done that there is a right answer. Okay, usually when I ask this in class, I get about close to a 50-50 response. The correct answer, at least as well as we can tell, is that you would probably live longer if you were missing an adaptive immunity. So let me show you an interesting set of experiments that supports that. So we can do a lot of just astonishing things with mice, and we've manipulated mice. There's such a thing as called knockout mice, where we can breed mice that don't have the ability to, do whatever. We've knocked out certain genes, so they're missing, some ability. So and I don't know what kind of infection they used in this experiment, but if we infected mice with some pathogen, normal mice, the pathogen is going to, reproduce, and then eventually the mouse's immune system will kick it off and it'll heal up. But if we work with SCID mice, so that's severe combined immunodeficient mice that are lacking T cells and B cells, but they do have PMNs, or in other words, neutrophils, and they do have macrophages, two cells that are very important in our innate immune response. You can see the pathogen multiplies, and then that innate immunity does kind of slow it down, at least, but has trouble totally getting rid of the infection. On the other hand, if we have mice that do not have the ability to make those polymorphonuclear leukocytes, or neutrophils, and they can't make macrophages, but they have T cells and B cells, the infection basically goes totally unchecked, because actually these innate cells are very important to call in the B cells and T cells and get them working. So, and the mice probably die eventually either way, but again, they're going to die a lot quicker if they don't have those really important cells for innate immunity. And some lower animals, I think, have much less developed adaptive immunity than what we do. So things like birds and reptiles have really good innate immunity, but not as good adaptive response. All right, so let's start with some of the physical barriers that our body has. Sometimes we call just these physical barriers our first line of defense. And we talked about how skin is a very poor portal of entry because we have really good defenses, and most of the time pathogens can't just penetrate through intact skin. And the reason, we mentioned this before, the outer layer of our skin are dead cells. And it's a pretty thick layer of dead cells. Here's a close-up of our outer layer of skin. So dead cells, dry, crusty, and so that's a pretty inhospitable place. Those dead cells are constantly being lost. So we have constant desquamation. That's just the sloughing off of these dead cells. They're constantly being lost. So when pathogens, if they do attach to them, they're constantly, those cells are falling off. Okay, and dust is basically made up a lot of our dead skin cells. Those of you that have indoor allergies are probably allergic not to, dust mites actually feed on those dead skin cells, and it's the feces of dust mites that a lot of us are allergic to. So, happy thought there. What else about the skin? There's a protein, a structural protein called keratin. And that's a protein, makes that outer layer of skin tough. Okay, there are some, insects or whatever that can pierce it. But basically, bacteria, for instance, the bacteria enzymes don't easily degrade that outer layers. They're pretty tough. There are a lot of chemical defenses here as well. We might as well talk about them while we're talking about the skin. Sebum is secreted by the sebaceous glands. Let's see. Let's try to find it on this picture here. I think that's what this is referring to, this oil gland. That sebum does lower the pH of the skin and makes the skin a little bit pliable. That's secreted here right around the hair follicle, because that is the one area that is a little bit, sometimes we get infections around our hair follicles. Also, I'm running out of room here, our sweat glands secrete sweat. And of course, that is in order to cool the surface of our body, but that sweat is also very salty. Okay, so kind of a hypertonic environment, that's going to likely dehydrate bacterial cells. Okay, so tough outer layer, outer layers are made of dead cells. pH of the skin is a little bit lower than what would be hospitable for a lot of bacterial growth. It's kind of a salty place. Plus, there's lots of other chemical defenses that we're kind of going to gloss over. There's some cells that are working there that we'll mention soon. So, inhospitable place, not a common portal of entry. I think, here's another picture from your book showing the sebaceous glands there around the hair follicle. And there are bacteria that can secrete lipase that is going to degrade that sebum, and those are the kind of organisms that cause acne. We talked about how the mucous membranes are a much more common portal of entry. We do have defenses here, but it's just a thinner layer of cells. We do have some resident microbes there just because it's a nice moist place, and we'll talk about their role as well. But again, mucous membranes, they're just going to line any opening of our body to the outside. Like I said, thin layer of cells. The cells along the mucous membranes, they're all alive, so we don't have layers of dead cells. We're going to see how they secrete mucus or what cells do that. But even though they're alive, those cells are constantly being shed. So again, that helps with the adhesion of pathogens. So note my spelling of mucus. English, crazy language. When mucus is a noun, we spell it like this, M-U-C-U-S. When it's an adjective, like describing membranes, we spell it with an O. Great. So I didn't make a mistake. That's the correct spelling. The mucus is produced by a certain kind of cell over in the picture here. It's again produced by goblet cells. And also in the respiratory tract, we have a special kind of cell called ciliated columnar cells. Okay, so you can see those over here. You can see the cilia that's reaching into our respiratory tract. That cilia is going to act to propel mucus out of the lungs in what's described as a mucociliary escalator. Okay, so cilia act by this mucociliary escalator. Hopefully I spelled that close. So the mucus that is expelled here along our respiratory tract, that is expelled by the action of the cilia up our respiratory tract, and either most of that we swallow. And it goes down into our stomach. Maybe we cough it up or sneeze it out. But from what I read, we produce about 1 liter of mucus every day. Not saliva, I'm talking about mucus. So that's an enormous amount. If you picture a 2 liter of pop, okay, about half of that, most of that we swallow, and that's to try to, catch pathogens that are expelled by that mucociliary escalator. Now, if somebody is a smoker, that's going to inhibit the action of cilia. So smokers generally have a harder time expelling respiratory pathogens, and in fact, they may lose the ability to make cilia at all. There's also lots of antimicrobial peptides on our mucous membranes. Your book goes into a lot of them. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about that. We have mentioned lysozyme. That was the enzyme that we said that viruses will bring with them to enter viral cells as well as lyse them. Not enter viral cells, enter bacterial cells as well as lyse them. That lysozyme breaks that bond in peptidoglycan between the NAG and NAM sugars. Okay, so lysozyme can act on bacterial pathogens. And again, lots of these that we're not going to take the time to get into. All right, here's another picture, yes, goblet cells. So it shows the microvilli here. That's in intestinal epithelium, so that's, part of absorbing nutrients in the intestine there. All right, and another scanning electron micrograph of some cilia from the trachea. Oh, right, I forgot to mention too, like there's lots of other mechanical actions that are taking place at mucous membranes. Of course, that peristalsis, the movement of food down the digestive tract, keeping things constantly moving, down into a very acidic place where that's obviously going to kill a lot of pathogens in our stomach. A lot of mucous membranes have flushing actions, so urine and tears, that's keeping microbes from becoming attached. So again, some kind of physical defenses that's maybe kind of their secondary function is being antimicrobial, but a function nonetheless. Okay, I also want to bring up the role of our normal microbiota. We have a lot of microbes on our mucous membranes, like I mentioned, because they're moist. And we would not be healthy without our normal microbiota, for the simple fact that they provide some antagonism. So, in other words, our resident microbes are going to be in competition with any invading microbes. Okay, so our resident microbes hopefully will outcompete invading microbes for space and nutrients. Okay, our resident microbes are already established, and the few invaders that we're exposed to hopefully will not be able to establish themselves. And of course, remember, the use of antibiotics are going to disrupt our microbiome and perhaps allow some other pathogens to proliferate. Very interesting stuff with mice is possible. So we've learned a lot from doing studies with mice that are raised in sterile, or sometimes we say axenic environments. When we take mice that are they're birthed in sterile conditions, and then they're grown up. They sterilize the bedding, they sterilize the food, they sterilize the water, they keep them in this, air filtered container. So essentially, these mice don't have any normal microbiota. And what they've found is that these mice are really small, for one thing. They don't grow very fast. And if they are exposed to some bacteria, say, oftentimes they don't have any defense to them at all, and they often die. So where a normal mouse, it wouldn't even make them sick, maybe one of these sterile mice, they might succumb to it. So from that, we can understand that our normal microbiota really plays a big role in stimulating the body's immune cells and processes, and kind of keeping our immune system kind of constantly primed and ready to go. There's a lot we don't understand. We don't understand why our immune system tolerates some microbes and doesn't tolerate others. Again, it's really complicated, and we have a lot to learn about it. We do know that our normal microbiota, in addition to stimulating our immune cells, they provide a lot of other services, improve our overall health. They produce some kinds of vitamins for us. We get a little extra folic acid that they have made and don't need. Some precursors of other vitamins like vitamin K that's important for clotting. So In other words, we would not be healthy if we didn't have this huge repertoire of microbes. So hopefully someday we'll figure out exactly what kind of cocktail of microbes really is necessary to make us healthy and be able to provide that. But we're not there yet. We will talk a little bit about a fecal microbiota transplantation that can potentially be done to treat C. diff, but we'll save that discussion from a couple weeks from now. All right, next video is going to concentrate on the beginning of some more chemical defenses, and we're going to focus especially on complement. Actually, sorry, one more slide, I almost forgot. To sum up where we're at, this is a table from your OpenStax, just summing up the physical defenses, some of the things that we talked about, barriers. We didn't mention too much of the mechanical defenses, and the microbiome. So yes, next, talk about complement. I'll save that for the next video.